I wanted to ask you, Bengt, about Joseph's attitude to the afterlife, if possible.
I don't think we talked very much about it. I mean, he's written about it, but I could say something about his, more or less, I think, his attitude toward religion and religiousness, I think, yeah. And now there is a tendency among the revisionist historians in Russia to turn him into a, orthodox kind of Christian, which he was not. He was very clear about this when we talked about it, and he's written about it too, that he was among the Christian faiths, he preferred Protestantism or even Calvinism, right? He was very much against Russian Orthodoxy because it was so close to the state always, right? And he hated the state as such, right? What he liked about Protestantism and Calvinism, which is a more severe version of Protestantism, is that you have the last judgment with yourself every day, instead of going to the priest, and telling him that you've done something bad and he will absolve you, right? So he was very, very firm about this. Nevertheless, I mean, what they're trying to do in Russia now it's appalling. A book came out a couple of months ago, which is by one of these terrible Russian nationalists. I mean, very, very right wing, yeah? And they're trying to turn Joseph into an orthodox imperialist poet. Yeah.
Sounds like quite an
Yeah, it's terrible, because he's written nothing to that effect, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I can say about Afterlife. I think he wasn't religious more in the kind of sense that most of us are religious. That we feel there is something that is higher than ourselves, or sort of more valuable than ourselves, right? That was his religion, I would say. Other than that his religion was, I would say, language and poetry. That's why I call my book about him Language is God, because it's not his expression, but he says in one of the interviews, if I would say something about God, it would probably be that language is like God or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I told you a little about that. About he really rejected translators who wouldn't rhyme his poetry and all that. Mm. And I think in effect he was right, because there is this general idea that poetry shouldn't be rhymed. I mean, in the West, since modernism, in the 20s and 30s, especially after the war, that poetry isn't rhymed. You don't need rhymes. Well, my answer to that is, since poetry hasn't been rhymed in, almost hasn't been rhymed in English, for example, in German or in Swedish, most languages, there are so many rhyme words that are available that haven't been used, right? I mean, one of Joseph's great things was that he combined modern vocabulary, slang, modern technology, with the language of the 18th century, for example. That creates an enormous effect, right? Well, since nobody's rhymed in this country, for example, since 1945, all the modern words are unrhymed, they're unused, they're very fresh as a rhyme. So you can do it. And I'll tell you a story which is quite interesting. I was working, when he left me copies of his poems when he left Sweden every summer, I tried to translate some of it. Yeah, some of it was too difficult, and it was too difficult for him too, to do it into English, because too much in that poem was sort of language based, right? And I remember calling him once, and I said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm trying to translate this poem into English," he said, his own poem. "Oh, it's funny," I said, "because I'm trying to do the same thing into Swedish." "And how does it go?" "Well, I'm working on this and this expression. I can't find an English equivalent to it." Right? And once I told him that in one of the poems, it's called, what is it called in English? It's called Nazidani in Russian. Admonition is called in English. And I told him I had to make a slight semantic adjustment in order to rhyme. And I said, "Oh, that's great," he said. "That's exactly what I wanted to say, but I couldn't because of the rhyme." In Russian, he said. So I had to make a compromise himself because of the rhyme. Right? And this was interesting. You can do it in any language, I mean, but it takes an enormous amount of time. And also, what he could do, what I couldn't do, he could change a line, because he was the author in both cases, right? Both in English and in Russian. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But if I change the lines, people will say, Brodsky doesn't say that, you know. So I asked him, you know, if he has a poem both in Russian and in English, and sometimes he would change the stanza because he couldn't, you know, he couldn't do in English what he did in Russian, so he changed the metaphor, for example. So then we agreed that I could, you know, pick whatever I thought was best for my translation, so I could take from the English or from the Russian, right? From the Russian. So, but it takes time, but it's possible to do, yeah.
Well, my thoughts on the afterlife are quite simply, I don't know. I don't know, and I think that belief is kind of irrelevant when it comes to, well, when it comes to anything, really. So I don't know about the afterlife. I don't know if there is one. I don't know if there isn't one. And I don't have any notions of belief about it either way.
But you have a religious belief?
No, I'm not religious.
No.
If I'm sort of devoted to anything, I would say it would be non-violence and attempting to be kind. And that's about as close to...
well, Joseph would say, you know, when they asked him, sometimes I'm religious, sometimes I'm not, you know. It's a natural reaction towards these very, very complex questions, right? Unless you are religious, then of course it's blasphemy, right, if you say so. But it's sometimes, you know, I believe more, sometimes I believe less, because, you know, nobody's been there, right?
I feel like when you, when there's something that you just don't know about, like the afterlife, like what happens after you die, when you sort of assume a belief about something, it kind of closes off areas of questioning.
Mm-hmm.
And
of course, yeah.
That's something that I try to disincline myself from doing.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the power of language, again, I'm not a skilled linguist or an academic, but I definitely note the importance of communication. And when you can really communicate with somebody, so really tailor your thought and your idea to the person who you're talking to, and use a language which is dynamic and receptible to them, it creates a kind of intensity in that moment and in your bond, which is special and invigorating.
I wanted also to ask, Bengt, if I may, if Joseph had ever made any mention to you about money. I believe he had read the Hebrew Bible, and I believe it's in the Hebrew Bible where it's mentioned that money is the root of all evil. Did Joseph ever speak with you about money?
Well, he was an extremely generous person, as if money didn't matter to him, you know. I would even say that he was careless about money.
I've heard that before.
In a positive way, he would always, you know, invite you and pay for you and whatever. I don't think that's always, you know, positive when you have a family, perhaps. But he was generous I think Russians in general are generous when it comes to money, because money is, I mean, according to the Russian tradition, I would say it's considered to be a little, you know, bourgeois, you know, a little kind of despicable, right?
Not anymore.
Not anymore, of course. You're right, but I mean, in the old tradition, it was like that, you know. I mean, you're not supposed to talk about money and use it, right? Yeah. So that's more or less all I can say. He was very happy when he was well paid. I remember him telling me that sometimes, you know, for some articles he was paid extremely well, because it was at the end of the year, I remember, and he would get an enormous amount of money from, I think it was the New Yorker or the New Yorker Review Books, something like that, you know, an enormous amount of money, because they had to spend it because it was the end of the budget year, right? And he was happy about that, of course, you know. But he didn't, you know, he didn't save money like a bourgeois would do. No, quite on the contrary.
Yeah. Anna, would you like to contribute your thoughts about money, in contrast perhaps to your father's?
I definitely feel, as I mentioned previously at dinner, that when you have somebody who's acting in a way that is profitable from the humane perspective, you are expending the maximum amount of energy for a minimum, or at least a sustainable return of energy. Whereas in a monetary framework of reference, when you're trying to be profitable in a monetary sense, you're expending the minimum amount of energy for the maximum return, the maximum revenue.
You as in the corporate you?
You, one. Yeah, the corporate you, I suppose. But even a person, you know, for a kind of crude example is, for example, a cab driver. If somebody is desperately in need of a lift but doesn't have any of their money, the humane thing to do would be like, oh, come with me, I've got the means to transport you to this place and I will do so. But the the financially shrewd thing to do would be not to let them in, because you are not going to be monetarily profitable from that exchange, that type of exchange. And I definitely think that having a culture which is kind of based around this perversion gives rise to all sorts of problems